Ephphatha, be opened. At Thursday's Evensong, I offered a lead-in to this morning's sermon, and it began with an meditation on an image of a chorister at choir camp a few weeks ago. And the image centers on a boy on a tire swing, and he's seeming to calculate the risks and benefits of pushing himself off the huge tree in front of him to swing with complete abandon. And we left the homily not knowing whether he would go for it or if he'd walk away. Now, that first reflection explored the potential to live life fully with God and to let go of our own sense of power, to fully enjoy the ride, as in giving in to gravity and Newton's third law of motion would have propelled that boy. And in our spiritual language, to let go of our egos in order to discover the thrill of life completely given over to God. To let ourselves swing freely amid vivid, holy color. So today, let's consider this image of the boy on the swing from some different angles, a sort of prequel and then later sequel to that story. We'll start at the time, the moment, just prior to the potential momentum. Like the boy's pause to consider his possibilities, life in full awareness of God begins in stillness. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. In this sort of stillness described in Genesis began God's creation. And by our inviting this stillness, we can discern our part in the ongoing creation of God's world. When we quiet ourselves long enough, we can see the beauty of life with God all around us. In the tire swing analogy, the full and lush leaves enveloping the massive and imposing tree trunk represent God's fulsome embrace no matter what we face in life. In our here and now, in our oh back then, in our if only laters, God presents herself to us with that offer, a solid, eternally rooted source of life that calls to us saying, take hold, grab on, I am here, and I've got you. Ephphatha, be opened. Be open to the wholeness that waits for you in silence. In the spiritual classic, The Sacrament of the Present Moment, Jean-Pierre de Caussade explained a contemplative understanding of what happens when we quiet ourselves and open our hearts to God. He wrote, in order to walk with God, we must confine ourselves to the present moment without taking thought for the one before or the thought after, so that stirrings of grace can be followed, so that God can direct us. This translation of a 17th century work seems oh so relevant today. It shows his understanding that God speaks to every individual through what happens moment by moment, second by second. As one authority on de Caussade summarized, cutting through the maze of religious obligations that encrust the gospel, de Caussade declared, quote, the only condition necessary for this state of self-surrender is the present moment in which the soul, light as a feather, fluid as water, innocent as a child, responds to every movement like the grace of a floating balloon. Much like the Syrophoenician woman in the gospel who sought the presence of Jesus, and similar to the deaf and mute man healed, our simply acknowledging our presence with God leads us to healing and wholeness. And just as it was a woman in today's gospel who led Jesus to clarify his own message of invitation to the table, it was women who preserved de Caussade's teachings for others, for us. In the introduction to one translation of his work, it says that as the French Revolution razed the country and religious orders were forced into hiding, the sisters at Nancy secretly shared his wisdom throughout the country. And after more than 100 years, his works were finally published. These ideas have been the grounding for seekers of God all these centuries that followed. This sort of quieting ourselves that the great contemplatives reveals shows us an awareness of healing that comes from the presence of God, and that we need to expand our healing view beyond our own experience. If you don't already have a daily practice, I hope you find one. I hope you find a way to take grounding in God, be it in worship, private prayer, music, meditation, exercise, surfing, painting, whatever your thing is that brings you into stillness. Find it and find God there. Cynthia Bourgeault writes this of her childhood praying in a Quaker school. It was in that silence as I gazed up at the sunlight sparkling through those high upper windows, or followed a secret tug drawing me down into my own heart, I began to know a prayer much deeper than talking to God. She continues, somewhere in those depths of silence, I came upon my first experiences of God as a loving presence that was always near, and prayer as a simple trust in this presence. Bourgeault continues, this was about the simplest form of prayer there is. Children recognize it, perhaps because, as the 16th century mystic John of the Cross said, silence is God's first language. Ephphatha, Jesus said, be opened. Be open to the silence and find the grounding there that takes you to the source of all being. Don't go to God just because there's nothing better, although that's true. No, grab hold of God's deeply rooted source of life, because God is calling to us all to come to the table, to claim our part in our healing and in the needs of the world. Return for a moment to the image of the boy in the tire swing. Now imagine him turning around and seeing the KN95 mask he's wearing to protect himself from COVID. Now pull back further to frame the tree with the yellow-gray smoky sky above it, and between you and the boy and the tree. So much of truthful, meaningful living is about perspective. Not perspective as in how we look at something, but that we look at something. Floods, purple air, COVID, lies, iniquity, white supremacy. We know the litany. And honestly, I'm pretty sure that child protective services would be called if we treated children the way we do the earth and the people on it. Still, rather than plugging our ears and biting our tongues, we can ready ourselves to look at the troubles around us and to be a part of the healing that is calling us. Take your mind's eye back to the boy on the swing. He has stilled himself enough now to know what he should do. One hand loosely holds the chain that connects the tire to the tree. The other is planted on what would be the seat of the tire. Having looked within himself, he knows he has what he needs to hoist himself up and get going. We who are watching really, really hope he will. And the viewer behind us has already, ever so quietly, assured him that he has everything he needs.